The first return hit at 02:17, a single, dense mass on the scope, too large to be weather, too steady to be aircraft, parked over a stretch of Oregon timber that should have been empty. The operator ran the sweep again. Same bearing, same range. No drift, no fade. On the third pass, the echo didn't just persist. It sharpened as if something had moved closer without moving at all. They tried secondary, then backup, then a handheld unit outside the trailer. Every screen agreed. One immobile return, broader than the tree line sitting in the fog like a ship anchored in midair. Command asked for visual confirmation. The patrol leader answered with silence and a hard look. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud, that you can't confirm what your eyes refuse to hold. They went anyway. This channel documents frontline accounts like this one. Subscribe for future reports. In 1994, the radar site sat on the edge of a logging corridor, a quiet piece of Army infrastructure that most people never noticed. 2 trailers, a small generator shed, a dish array behind a chain-link fence, and a crew that spent more time fighting damp wiring than any real threat. That night began like every other. Routine checks, calibration sweeps, a weather layer moving through the valley. Nothing that justified waking a supervisor. When the immobile return held through multiple scans, the watch chief treated it like equipment failure. He swapped cables, reset the processor, and ran a manual diagnostic. The system reported green across every line. The problem was the echo. It had a footprint too wide for a helicopter, too dense for birds, too clean for ground clutter, and it sat at a fixed altitude that didn't make sense. By 02:40, a call went out. A unit was tasked to walk in. We stepped off from the service road just after 03:10, moving under the trees where the fog thickened into layers. The point man kept his light low, angled at the ground to avoid washing out our own night vision. Even with NVGs, the timberline in that part of Oregon swallowed depth. Trunks became columns. Branches became ceilings. Every distance felt wrong. We had the grid reference from the radar trailer, a rough bearing and range translated into a box on a map that was never meant to be walked at night. The watch chief stayed on the radio with us, relaying updates every few minutes. The return hadn't moved. Not a slide, not a drift. Just a hard, stubborn block on the scope, as if the radar were painting a cliff face suspended in the air. The first thing that felt off wasn't the forest. It was our own equipment. At 03:18, my handset started hissing, thin, steady interference that rose and fell like someone breathing into a microphone. The push-to-talk worked, but every message came back clipped, as if the air itself was chewing consonants. The squad leader had us check frequencies. We went to our alternate, then our contingency. The noise followed us like a shadow, never loud enough to call jamming, never clean enough to ignore. By 03:25, the return changed in only one way. The edge became sharper. The watch chief described it as more defined, like the system had improved resolution without any adjustment. That made no sense. The system was the same. The atmosphere was worse, but the echo was clearer. We pushed deeper. The ground started to show signs that didn't fit the area. Not tracks, nothing that resembled a normal animal print, but wide depressions in the wet soil, irregular and heavy, as if something had stood still long enough to sink into the earth. Between them were dragged streaks where grass had been flattened and mud smeared, not in a line like a vehicle, but in short, violent arcs, like a weight shifting and grinding in place. Nobody said, "Big." Nobody said anything at all for a full minute. We just looked. Lights still kept low. The squad leader finally spoke, voice tight. "Mark it. Don't linger." We flagged the nearest depression with a strip of tape and moved around it. The mud had a sour smell, like wet iron and pine rot. It clung to our boots in thick mats, heavier than it should have been. At 03:34, the point man stopped so abruptly the second man almost ran into him. He held up a fist, then pointed at the air with 2 fingers. In the fog ahead, between the trunks, there was a space that didn't behave like the rest of the forest. It wasn't a clearing. It wasn't an opening. It was a thickness, like the mist had condensed into a wall. a faintly darker vertical plane that swallowed the beam of a flashlight instead of reflecting it. One of the soldiers swept his light across it. The cone of illumination weakened as it entered that space, as if something absorbed it. The edges of the beam frayed. The air looked bruised. The watch chief came over the radio, his tone shifting from routine to strained. "You're at the edge of it. The return is centered on your position. It's still dead still." That sentence landed wrong. Centered on our position. Still dead still. We were looking at trees and fog. The radar was insisting we were standing inside a mass. The squad leader ordered a halt. He turned, headlamp shielded, and made eye contact down the line. No panic, no theatrics, just men doing the math in their heads. He told me to take 2 steps forward with the handheld unit and stop. The handheld was supposed to be a confirmation tool, not a primary sensor, but it was all we had in our hands that could speak the same language as the trailer. I moved. The fog swallowed my knees. The ground dipped under me. The static on my radio rose. On the device screen, the return wasn't a dot. It was a wide smear with a hard edge, exactly where my own body should have been. When I shifted the unit, the smear didn't slide like a target. It stayed fixed, as if the device were painting a surface that didn't care what angle I looked from. I stopped. The soldier behind me whispered something that never made it into my ear cleanly. Just breath and a broken syllable. The squad leader asked for a range estimate. I couldn't give him one. The handheld insisted the return was close. Too close. Yet the trees in front of me didn't change. The world looked normal, but the device behaved as if I was holding it inches from something enormous. Then the forest went quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. It wasn't the absence of birds. It was the absence of small, random sound. No distant creak of branches, no insects, no soft hiss of wind through needles. Even our gear sounded muted. Fabric against fabric. A boot shifting in mud. Everything was damped, like we'd stepped into a room lined with insulation. The squad leader called for a slow withdrawal, 1 step at a time, no sudden movement. He kept his voice low and even, the way you speak around a sleeping animal you can't see. As we began to back away, the return on the handheld didn't change, but the static on the radio did. It wasn't noise anymore. Under the hiss there was a rhythm, uneven, heavy, too slow to be a human breath, pulsing against the channel like pressure, like something large and close, forcing air through a space it didn't fit. The watch chief tried to speak. His words arrived distorted, then cut out entirely. We stood in the fog with no clean comms, a fixed return inside our own position, and a section of air that refused light. And then, somewhere ahead of us, deeper than the trees, closer than distance should allow, something shifted its weight. It wasn't a footstep the way people imagine footsteps. There was no snap of twig, no crunch of leaf litter. It was a low, wet compression, mud taking weight, followed by a slow grind, like something pressing down and settling. The fog in front of us thickened, then parted in a way that felt wrong, not like wind, more like an object displacing it. The point man's flashlight trembled and lifted, instinct overriding training. The beam cut higher, catching the trunks, then empty air. Then it hit something that should not have been there. A shoulder, not a silhouette, not a shadow. A surface, wet, textured, uneven, fur matted to heavy skin. The light didn't pass through it or fade. It reflected off it in dull streaks, revealing ridges, scars, and mud smeared into the hair like it had crawled through a riverbank. The beam climbed. A neck, a jawline, a face with a heavy brow and deep-set eyes that didn't glow, didn't shine, just looked back with the flat focus of something deciding whether you were a threat. For a second, nobody moved. The squad leader didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He did the only thing he could do, kept his hands low, kept his posture controlled, and backed a half-step without turning his body away. The creature leaned forward as if that movement alone was enough to compress the space between us. One arm came down and forward, long fingers opening and closing once, not reaching, not grabbing, testing. The other arm hung heavier, pulled back, like a spring under tension. I glanced at the handheld. The radar return was no longer a smear. It was a solid mass, filling the near range, so close it made the scale meaningless. The blip sat on top of us like a weight. The soldier on my left made a small sound. Shock more than fear. A breath that didn't belong in a forest that had gone soundless. Another man's hands tightened on his rifle so hard his knuckles whitened under the glove seams, but he didn't shoulder it. None of us did. Not because we were brave, because every part of the scene said that firing would be a mistake you couldn't take back. The creature's lips pulled slightly, just enough to show the hint of teeth, not a roar. Something restrained, irritated, like an animal warning you it was at the edge of control. Then the radio hiss surged into a single hard burst, and the flashlight beam flickered. In that brief drop of light, the creature didn't vanish. It moved. As soldiers scrambled to form a defensive perimeter, the air seemed to thicken with tension. The creature, a massive, hulking form that had once appeared only as a faint radar echo, was now unmistakable. Its towering figure moved deliberately toward the squad, crushing the underbrush beneath its enormous weight. The trees, which once shielded the team's position, now felt like weak barriers against the impending threat. Sergeant Harris, gripping the radio, barked commands into the comms, but it was as if the creature was immune to the warnings. The beast's eyes, glowing faintly in the dusk, locked onto them with a predatory focus. In those final moments, it wasn't the sound of the jungle or the crackle of the radio that filled the air. It was the deep rumble of something massive, closing in. Corporal Jenkins, still clutching the radar equipment, felt the weight of the moment. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the realization. This was no longer a reconnaissance mission. Their presence, the signals they had picked up, had drawn the creature's attention. It was now personal. The last communication they received wasn't an order. It was a warning. "Get out now!" But it was too late. The ground shook, the trees groaned, and all sense of control was lost. The creature's roar echoed through the forest, a sound that would haunt them long after. In the chaos, 2 soldiers were caught off guard. The rest, having barely time to react, were forced into a hasty retreat. There would be no medals for bravery today, only survivors. At first light, the scope went blank. No drift, no fade, just nothing. We were recalled, separated, and debriefed as if the night had been a weapons test. Every statement was rewritten until it sounded ordinary. The radar tapes were collected. The handheld log was seized. 2 minutes were missing from each file, and no one admitted editing them. The report labeled it unresolved interference and sealed the grid as restricted. A week later, the trailers were removed and the access road graveled over. Officially, nothing occurred. Only partial accounts remain. The watch chief transferred out, and nobody asked why again.